Welcome, everyone. My name is Minouche Shafik, and I'm the director of the London School of Economics and Political Science. And welcome to this event entitled Life After COVID, Challenges and Policy Response. Now, we know from history that after some crises, the world fundamentally changes, like after the Great Depression or World War II. But we also know that after other crises, not much fundamentally changes, like World War I or the financial crisis in 2008. And often that lack of change comes back to haunt us. With COVID, many of us long to a return to normal life without physical distancing, lockdowns, fear, and loneliness. But the crisis has revealed major problems in our societies, and there's a growing appetite for change. What are those things that should change, and what should our policy response be? And we have four outstanding speakers to help us think through this question. All have led their countries through various major crises, and they will share their insights with us on how not to let this crisis go to waste. The advantage of having such well-known speakers is I don't have to spend a long time introducing them, so I'll be very brief. We'll start with Kevin Rudd, who was Prime Minister of Australia during the 2008 financial crisis, having previously served as Foreign Minister and currently is associated with a huge number of think tanks and universities and foundations. Following that, we'll hear from Michelle Bachelet, who was twice elected President of Chile, having previously been Minister of Health and Defense, and of course was the first woman in those roles. She's currently the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. She'll be followed by Helen Clark, who served 3 successive terms as the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and then 2 terms as the head of the United Nations Development Programme and chair of the UN Development Group. And then finally, we hear from Matteo Renzi, who was Prime Minister of Italy, the youngest Prime Minister in Italy's history, previously was Mayor of Florence, and now Senator of the Electoral College of Florence. I'm going to encourage our speakers to range widely and think about the consequences for democracy and governance, our economies, health, society, and the environment. And after they speak, my colleague Andrés Velasco, who's the Dean of the School of Public Policy at the London School of Economics, will moderate questions from the audience. So let me turn first to Kevin Rudd. I think he's still on mute. Could we unmute? There we are. Over to you, Kevin.
Thank you very much, Minouche. And it's great to be with friends and colleagues, and particularly those with the London School of Economics, a great global institution. A few reflections in the 5 or 6 minutes that you've allocated to each of us for initial remarks. First, in terms of strategic policy change in the post-COVID world in terms of domestic political governance. For me, the central message coming out of this has to do with 2 things, and perhaps 3. One is the absolute centrality of tackling the inequality agenda, because what we have seen with this virus and so many other crises in the past, be they public health, financial or economic crises, is the disproportionate impact on those who are less equipped to defend themselves. And rather than that just being a normative statement from the usual progressive voices from the centre left, I would simply say enlightened self-interest should suggest itself to the centre right around the world that unless you do this, a democratic capitalism ultimately implodes. Of course, 2 sub-elements of that equality agenda are these. You either have an equitable public health system or you don't. And if it is inequitable, then the capacity for rapid implosion in other directions, as we've seen with various disturbances around the world, become rapidly manifest. And a second subset of the governance point is this, and that is, given the nature of the virus, but frankly, given where the structure of the global economy is headed anyway. This is the clarion clear signal to finally wrestle the digital divide to the ground. That is, those people who have been most disadvantaged economically are those who have had less access to reliable digital technologies, either to maintain themselves in some form of employment or not, or to maintain connection or not. So therefore, this is not just a classic cri de coeur from the centre left, it has materiality to it. And therefore, if not taken seriously, then the fabric of capitalism, be it liberal democratic or social democratic capitalism, comes unstuck. Second set of points I'd make concerns the question of a deep strategic learning and a dangerous non-learning, that if we think this is a normal economic recovery, where environmental sustainability questions are cast to one side, then frankly, we are simply storing up for ourselves an even bigger set of implosions in the period ahead. And the truth is, whether it's at a G20 level or an OECD level or a G7 level, the architecture for a genuine green recovery does not require rocket science, let alone a Rhodes Scholarship. And therefore, it is quite clear what governments can do to lead their economies in a recovery direction which is green and sustainable, and takes this as a massive strategic opportunity to turn the corner on global climate action. That's my second point. My third and my final one in the allocated time is a strategic policy learning in terms of international governance. This is not the time to rehearse the rights and wrongs, the ups and downs, and who's to blame and who's not to blame for the World Health Organization and the blame game between the WHO and national governments in terms of actions taken or not taken in various countries around the world to deal with COVID-19. But it is a clarion clear cry to the peoples of the world in the 21st century is that global governance must work. It must be effective. Since the Ebola crisis, I think those of us who are familiar with the UN system, Helen in particular and Michelle, these are both deeply experienced practitioners. Following the Ebola crisis, we have had, in my count, 3 separate external reviews of the World Health Organization, all of which have come up with identical sets of recommendations, for which member states, that is all of us, that is those who form the Committee of Governance of the WHO, have been absolutely indolent in acting on. And so I take that, not just for the WHO, but the other critical institutions of global governance, that given the challenges we face in the future are progressively global in nature, pandemics, global financial management, climate, then the clarion clear message for all of us is to invest in credible diplomatic, political, and what I would describe as financial triage of these systems and institutions to survive them effectively into the future. Great power politics will always be blamed for dysfunction. Yes, there's a fair bit of that, but a lot of it is collapsing finance, collapsing collective political will by, let's call it, the collectivity of strong, constructive powers, middle powers, call them what you will in the international system. So there are 3 thoughts in terms of policy challenges which are doable for the future. Thanks, Minouche.
Very good. Thank you, Kevin. Let me turn straight away to Michelle Bachelet.
Thank you, Minouche. I think for months now, the COVID-19 pandemic has been challenging our societies, our governments, ourselves, testing our leadership or lack of leadership, I would say, and humanity, and disrupting the lives of millions of people on the planet. But I think the pandemic needs and demands decisive, coordinated, and innovative action if we want to be able to defeat it. So my key message will be in this regard is that this is a human rights crisis. So the recovery efforts will only be effective if with the human rights front and center. Because we know exactly when we're talking about a pandemic and a virus that until everyone is safe, no one is safe. And I think that will be very important in a lot of other discussions when we think on vaccines, that we need to ensure that it will be a global public good, because otherwise we won't be able to defeat it. So I think Kevin was saying, and for all of us that have been in politics fighting inequalities our whole lives, is that COVID-19 has laid bare the inequalities that were there usually, and of course have laid bare also models, economic models and ways of looking at the state role that shown how weak they were, because for many years state did not invest in public health, for example, because it was believed that it was not necessary. State were weakened in many places because they were not thought that should be strong. And I think we have been seeing with the COVID-19 that state have been fundamental. That doesn't mean that other stakeholders are fundamental as well. We need the private sector, of course, but state continue having a very important protection role. The other thing that I think Kevin said, and I completely agree, and I've been talking about all these days, that when we talk about going back to normality, of course, we cannot go back to the 0 day before. Because of course, COVID-19 has shown a lot of things, but we follow protests and conflicts all over the world. Last year, we have 80 countries with people on the streets, including mine, protesting against the economic system, against poverty, against discrimination, against inequalities, or in some other places against corruption and political inadequacy of the government. So COVID is not, it's not that we now identify something that is new. It was there, and we have to look at this opportunity on the response, and in particularly on the recovery, on what has been said to build back better, in thinking which is the kind of society, which is the kind of economy, how we relate private sector to state, etc., etc. But let me focus a little more on inequality and social infrastructure, because I think that COVID-19 is exposing the dramatic effects of decades of underspending in health, water, sanitation, housing, social protection, and of policies eroding labor rights and decent work. Because it's true, the virus does not discriminate, but it affects disproportionately certain groups. And social and economic exclusion is frequently aggravated by the multiple impact of multiple intersecting forms of discrimination, which are based on age, gender, race or ethnicity, migration status, sexual orientation, disability or health status, and of course it can be perpetuated as well with harmful gender, cultural or social norms and stigma. Older people as well are particularly affected, indigenous people as well. So why I mention this, because when people are thinking on the recovery, how they're going to do it, usually they try to think on as an homogeneous, as all people will be the same. And it's not like that. We really need to make the recovery an opportunity to leave no one behind. We need to include all these risk factors and have policies that really will reach them. Otherwise they'll be left behind. And we have a problem because the majority of countries do not have disability data. Maybe they have gender data. Maybe they can have data by age, or maybe for indigenous, in some countries they don't have any of those. But the intersecting risk factors of all of them, almost any country has it. So I think it means for us to be, as UN, to help much more governments to try to identify, to do the mapping, if I may say, of the discrimination and inequalities, and try to identify which are the best policy for that. Of course, we need also to strengthen social infrastructure with state efforts to build universal social protection system, crucial tool to curb poverty and inequality, and to access and facilitate access to healthcare, while at the same time protecting the enjoyment of economic and social rights such as food, health, social security, education, housing, and water. The other thing that I believe is very important, because the other group that has been particularly affected is women. Women, because poor old women, usually they don't have pension, they don't have social schemes, or women, they work a lot on the informal economy, and with the lockdowns that have been really affected. So any recovery has to have also a gender lens. And the other thing that I want to say, that for the 12 countries that are supposed to have the best response to the crisis and to the COVID-19, 7 are led by women. So I think it's a good time that not only people go outside to applaud the health workers, the majority women, but also to acknowledge that women can be very good leaders as well. So Democracy has been fundamental. I think in those countries where you have democratic values, where people can participate and be part of the response, where people have access to freedom of information, of expression, where you have press freedom, it has been much better because people are aware, understand why it's needed to do what is being done by the governments, and they have a better response. Unfortunately, we have seen shrinking space for shrinking civic space, and we've seen many of these urgency measures used to harass and to avoid freedom of express. Finally, I want to say that to build back better, I think we need to take into consideration that we need a new economy that is inclusive, that is sustainable or greener, however you want to call it, that has a gender lens as well, but also that we have to include the environmental issues as a very important thing. We need to continue working on climate change because 70% of the emergent diseases in the world are zoonoses caused by animals to human beings. I'm a doctor, so I'm always trying to understand these things. And Ebola, SARS, MERS, and now COVID-19 are zoonoses as well. So if we don't respect nature and if we don't respect biodiversity, we will only have more and more pandemics in the future. So I think we need to use this opportunity to really rethink on how we develop a way to recover that is completely different. I mean, maintain the good things, but improve the so many bad things that we have today in the world. And finally, COVID-19 shows so clearly something that many of us have been always, that on global challenges, you need global responses and the importance of multilateralism, because many of these things, pandemics, climate change, conflicts, migration, etc., they're also intersecting issues that will produce a lot of bad consequences for humanity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was wonderful. Helen, let's turn to you.
Thank you, Minouche. Well, our topic gets us focused on the post-COVID world, but of course, that's not exactly with us. We've probably got another 18 to 24 months of this turmoil to run. And I think the outlook is very, very challenging. I think there's a lot of lessons we can learn from what's happened to our world and to our countries during the pandemic. But it's far from guaranteed that countries are going to learn any of those lessons. And in my humble opinion, if the world's citizens want a better future, they're going to have to stand up and demand it very, very loudly, and hope that, you know, at least some leaders are enlightened enough to be listening. We all take part in a lot of discussions which talk about how imperative it is that there's a reset post-pandemic, but that opportunity could easily be missed. Now, I think there's a range of things which could be focused on immediately as part of building back better. The first thing is pandemic preparedness. This pandemic is the 6th time that the WHO in the last 17 years has declared a public health emergency of international concern. So on average, that's about 1 every 3 3/4 years. These zoonotic diseases are going to keep coming at us. And if we're knocked flat again in the near term, the way we've been knocked flat by COVID, it's really unthinkable. And so drawing on the experiences of those who have handled the pandemic relatively well, I think would be wise. And I think there's a lot of lessons for governments in having transparent and open communication with citizens and being seen to rely on good scientific advice and be open to a range of advice. Building the trust that you know what you're doing and giving it your best stab and bringing your citizens with you. But pandemic planning, preparedness planning, I think is critical. I mean, linked to that is also the need to fix broken health systems. What have we seen around the world? We've seen a lack of coordination between the level of the state and regions and districts and so on. We've seen poor IT systems which don't talk to each other. We've seen the consequences of the lack of investment in population health. And I think a key thing that should come out of a reset is universal health coverage, which is a global goal. So many people don't enjoy it. How can you fight a pandemic, including in a Western country, if people fear the costs of coming forward for testing and possibly facing hospitalization. If you're an undocumented worker or a migrant, what do you faced with the prospect of illness when coming forward might lead to your deportation? So universal health coverage for everyone, everywhere, I think is vital. Third obvious point, and both Kevin and Michelle have touched on it, is to really focus in on the health, economic and social inequities, which have been exposed for all to see, if they'd never seen them before, by the pandemic. The disease has been so deadly to minority populations trapped in poverty. Lockdowns have denied those with subsistence livelihoods their sustenance. The ILO estimated back in April that half the livelihoods in the informal sector would go. And now there's a cri de coeur that comes out of this, and I know Michelle, who authored a letter report for the ILO, will identify with this: universal social protection. We didn't go into this pandemic with that, and that's been quite disastrous for so many people in so many countries. A fourth thing to focus on would be recommitting to the goal of education for all, because COVID-19 has exposed inequalities in education. I've just been part of the launch of UNESCO's latest Global Education Monitoring Report on inclusion in education, and they've done some rapid work to update it for this period of the pandemic, and say that 40% of low and middle income countries were not able to support learners who were at risk of exclusion during the crisis. Take, for example, Ethiopia, where for the bottom quintile of people on the income ladder, only 7% own a radio. So it's not even an issue of, could you get an iPad and the modem out? Forget that. Only 7% have a radio. And so, as Kevin touched on earlier, getting connectivity, the ability to connect with each other. We know how to do remote learning, but we often lack the most basic tools for it to reach every child and keep opportunity going. Needless to say, when you go through a pandemic with 80% or upwards of the learner population of the world out of school, there will be some children who never get back to school with their families impoverished and them going down a track of child labour. So I thought that would be, quite a practical list of things to focus on: pandemic preparedness, universal social protection, universal health coverage, education for all. And those points touch on a number of the key transformations that Jeff Sachs and Johan Rockstrom and others have talked about. But of course, to do those things requires investment. And one of the legacies of this pandemic is the most mind-boggling government deficits. If I, as Prime Minister, had ever envisaged that I would have a deficit the size of the one the New Zealand government and so many other governments now face for digging deep, you would be horrified. But of course, it's one thing for a Western country, which is bankable, to run up a deficit. For many of the world's emerging and developing countries, it's utterly disastrous. The IMF, I recall, estimated there was a need for 2.5 trillion for all the range of bailout and support mechanisms for those economies, and there's nothing like that amount of money that's come forward to help. So unless there's a massive mobilization of support now out through the international financial institutions, my fear is that in many of the developing and emerging economies, we will see austerity. We will see cuts in services. We will see continuing pressure on jobs and livelihoods. We're certainly seeing extreme poverty and hunger go up. We're likely to see more civil unrest, which in authoritarian states will be met by repression and human rights abuses. That will in turn propel pressures to flee. And in a way, think Venezuela writ large. When an economy collapses and the spillover impacts go all around the region, we could see that on a significant scale in the worst case scenario. We need a lot more international solidarity to stop that kind of scenario playing out. So, all that, and let me spend the last sort of 40 seconds on saying there's all the big questions then about whether we can reset in a way where we also restore and protect our ecosystems. You know, the pandemic is one in the syndemic of crises, the crisis of inequality, the crisis of climate, the crisis of biodiversity, the raging conflicts, which have caused, you know, roughly 1 in every 100 people on Earth to be forcibly displaced. The old order is very unattractive, but is there the leadership for the new order? Is there the leadership on the environmental side to stop the deforestation, to stop the wildlife trafficking, to stop the overfishing, to stop the degradation of fresh water and oceans, to radically bring down the fossil fuel footprints and move to sustainable energy, to tackle air pollution? You know, a post-COVID world really needs to be tackling these things. And as I say, it's not going to happen just because we wish it to. I think the world's citizens are going to have to mobilize for that new world with passion. Otherwise, we will blunder on to more mistakes as we work our way through more pandemics and more crises.
Okay, thank you, Helen, for those sobering remarks. We turn to Matteo.
Thank you so much. But I believe every consideration by Ruud, by Helen, by my friend Michelle are very interesting. So for me, I can use just 3 or 4 points to encourage the discussion for us. I agree with a lot of considerations of my former colleagues. And so, very briefly, first, this virus changed geopolitics around the world. Please come back to 6 months ago and you see a different world. A different world in the relation between USA and China. Very important and very interesting. We discussed 6 months ago about trade, about 5G, and for sure we will have in the next 10 years again a great tension between USA and China. But the change now is a change of narrative. And this change is particularly deep inside American politics. This, for me, is the first consequence of COVID. 6 months ago, my friend Joe Biden was considered from a lot of people with a man not able to win. During this period, also thanks a very great action from Joe and a very good politics from Democrat Party in USA, and particularly with the leadership inside of President Obama, now Joe Biden is not only a candidate, is maybe the favorite for the victory in the White House race in November. So first, everything is changed in the geopolitical situation and inside American politics. Second point, we really touch the change from caused from COVID in the European politics. After Lehman Brothers crisis, European leaders decided to continue with the same approach. They continue with austerity, they continued with the Pact of Stability and Growth, they continue with the rules, bureaucracy, red tape of bureaucracy, etc., etc. Now, also thanks to leadership of Ursula von der Leyen, of Angela Merkel, of Christine Lagarde, just to include also a man, not only women, Emmanuel Macron, I think really Europe changed direction. In 4 months of coronavirus, Europe changed more in the last 20 years. This is very important to image a new Europe for the future. I don't know what could happen in the next months in Europe, also because I consider the most great dangerous event in the European history will be in May 2022 with the new election in France, particularly if populists will be able to win Paris. But the second consequence is not simply a new relation very strong between USA and China and the consequence inside American politics, but also great consequences in the European institutions. Also because this event follow, of course, for casualty, Brexit. Because in case of presence of London inside EU, I think some decisions adopted by Brussels are absolutely impossible with the presence of UK inside EU. This is very sad for me because I'm a great fan of the presence of UK in EU, but we have to be very frank between us. Without UK, EU accept a new challenge. Just to conclude very briefly, I think it's very interesting to understand what could happen in two very important countries as Brazil and as India in the management of coronavirus. Because I remember the first statement against China, against Italy, against Europe from the leader as Bolsonaro and in part also President Modi. Prime Minister Modi. But I think if we discussed very seriously, now India and Brazil, for a lot of reasons, know a very great tension in the management of coronavirus. Fourth, and really last, we don't discuss too much about the consequences from coronavirus in the geopolitical area of Mediterranean. I believe that is a very important problem. Because in the last period, you can love, you can hate, but the soft power, not too much soft, the power of Russia in the area of Mediterranean is absolutely stronger than 3 months ago. That is true for Libya. That is true for the great tension about oil and gas. And that is an unbelievable question for the future of that strategic area, because it's true, after fracking, after shale gas, USA decided, not only with the President Trump, but maybe before with the President Obama, to reduce the role of USA in the area of Middle East and Mediterranean. This decision is very important and it's very historical for a lot of reasons, but that decision opened a lot of tension. And that decision called, in my view, NATO to play a role, because Turkey is a part of NATO, because there are a lot of tension in a little corner of a planet, but very important in terms of strategic. So I think that is geopolitical consequence from coronavirus. There are a lot of other points. My view is the next pandemic will be not a pandemic, will be the next global crisis, will be a cybersecurity attack, not a pandemic. And nobody today around the world is ready to use the protection and the system of intelligence all together, exactly as we were not able to use the healthcare system all together to defend from pandemic. Please consider that. And of course, it's very interesting to understand also is changed the public communication during a pandemic, because a lot of leaders, particularly in democracies, not out of democratic regime, a lot of that used the public communication with a very strong way. Also about it, it's very interesting to discuss.
Very good. Thank you very much, Matteo. Let me now hand over to my colleague, Andrés Velasco, who will moderate some of the many questions we've been getting online. Andrés?
Thank you very much, Minouche. Let me reiterate on behalf of the LSE and the School of Public Policy how delighted we are to have these 4 leaders from 3 continents joining us for this wonderful discussion this morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are. We're going to do a quick round of questions. I will take the chair's liberty and ask each one of our guests 1 question, and then we will open it up for Q&A with the public. I'm going to ask our guests to keep the responses about 2 or 3 minutes so that we have enough time to interact with our global audience afterwards. Kevin, let me begin with you. You were very emphatic in your first point that inequality must be on the agenda, but you added it is not enough to signal virtue by talking about inequality. We have to do something about it. And in this regard, it seems to me, I was reading a wonderful paper by Danny Roderick and Stephanie Stancheva, both Harvard professors this morning, who make the claim that we will not do away with inequality unless economies can provide good jobs. Of course, providing good jobs at a time when technology is destroying a lot of jobs is harder than ever. And with economies fairly slow, as are likely to be in the next couple of years, it is even harder. As a leader of the center left, looking forward, how do we make sure that we can fight inequality by providing jobs? Where do we find those jobs? And what kinds of policies can produce them?
I think two quick sets of points in response to your question, Andrés. One's to step back and just look at this philosophically. The future of capitalism hangs on we social democrats because those who believe in unrestrained liberal capitalism created the last financial crisis 10 years ago and have done little to repair the system since then. On the equality question, what happens is that liberal capitalism says, not my fault, not my problem, go and get a job. Having lived in the United States for the last 5 years, number of times I've heard that, it's almost a piece of quantitative research in itself. The problem is, if you are a liberal capitalist, then you're sowing the seeds for your own Schumpeterian destructionist moment. You'll blow up the system eventually. Social democrats have two sets of responsibilities. One is to grow the economy sustainably so that jobs are created. We cannot return to old forms of classical socialism. It doesn't work. So our job is to work constructively with markets to grow the economy, to create a new range of jobs and a better range of jobs. But on the way through, not to apologize for a continued role for the state, social democratic state, in various forms of industry policy intervention in the major economic drivers of the future, the new technology industries, the green revolution industries, and others. But my final point is this. Why do I say that this is the moment for social democrats worldwide? Is that we understand that to do that and to grow the economy through being engaged with the market, to deploy industry policy, to grow the industries of the future, we must have an equality agenda to bring people with us and to not allow them fall out of the social contract, and to have a decent universal social protection and decent universal public health provision. It is these three engines which hold together the fabric for the future. Engaging the market, not denying it. Secondly, investing in the industries of the future. I've listed just 2 or 3. I'm making no apology for that, as if it's some offense to the liberal capitalist model. They can jump in the lake as far as I'm concerned. And the third is, one deeper than the one sitting behind Helen on her screen. And the third is, we actually understand not just the ethics of action on equality through universal social insurance, but we understand the practicality of holding our societies together and to holding together a social democratic capitalist project.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Let me turn now to Michelle, Madam President. The Economist wrote recently that there are 2 pandemics in the world today. One is COVID-19. The other is a pandemic of power grabs, as dictator wannabes in many countries across the world use the emergency to seize extraordinary powers. There's also the perception, correctly probably, that AI and technology will be a boon for government supervision and bad for individual rights and privacy. How do we make sure, particularly from your seat and your current job, that out of this emergency, we get strengthened democracy and human rights and not a weakened state of rights for everyone?
Well, I'm not sure that we can ensure Andrés, but the things that we can do and we have been doing is we have been working with member states saying that even though we understand, and in the international human rights law, certain restrictions when you have either natural disasters or pandemics or crises like this is accepted. For example, the restriction of freedom of mobility or the restriction of freedom of assembly, that's perfectly well understood, but it has to be proportionate to the necessity. There has to be a clear necessity. It has to have a time bound. It has to be transparent and informed, etc. But also there are other freedoms that you cannot use as an excuse, a pandemic, like I said before, the freedom of expression, the freedom of press, etc. So I think the only way to do it is, on one hand, insisting on which other ways we should use this kind of emergency measures, what are the dangers on it, but also to, if I would say, step up and mention the cases that where we believe they have passed the lines. We have seen governments that they are governing by decree without respecting the rest of the judiciary or the parliamentary system. We have seen governments that are using technology, and one of the works we have been doing for some time is working with the technological sector, because we believe that human rights should not be considered as how we avoid that a technological tool will violate human rights. We think from before the design, it has to be thought on that. And we also believe that all these issues, because we have seen, for example, the need to trace contacts, that is a public health need, and it's important. But how do you then eliminate that information so it won't be used to other purposes that are not exactly the right ones? How you ensure the right to privacy? So we're working on that thing, giving guidances to member states, but also I think it's important that the different intergovernmental institutions are clear and I would say strong on these messages. Some people will try to use it as excuse, yes. And the other thing that I want to point out here is not only about what Kevin and Helen mentioned about the digital divide, but also I do believe that for technology, for particularly artificial intelligence and others, we do need regulation, international regulation. What kind of regulation we can discuss? And I think this kind of regulation, because you cannot have a system that can get into people's lives so complicated that it will be developed by each company's ethics office. So we need to put together public sector, private sector, scientists, academicians, society who works on this to discuss how we're able to ensure that technology is for good. So I think we're still very slow on this, and we have to continue working very strongly.
Thank you very much. I'll turn to Helen now. Helen, you spoke of international solidarity as being absolutely key during this crisis. The problem is we haven't seen much of it. And I am thinking particularly of the role of financing for developing countries, which is something, of course, you dealt with in your years at the UNDP. The IMF has estimated that the developing countries need 2.5 trillion. And the money is nowhere to be found. The fund itself will provide 1 trillion. Debt forgiveness efforts so far, especially those that involve the private sector, have failed miserably. So we could be looking at a decade maybe in which many of the advances in fighting poverty and developing a middle class in not just in the very low income countries, but even in middle class emerging countries are set back massively. So as we speak of international governance seem to be failing for reasons that are probably more political than technical. Any thoughts on what ways forward for this might look like?
Well, you're right. There has been nothing like the level of international solidarity needed to see the world through this crisis. There's one exception, and that is the European Union and a group of partners did bring together the sort of conference for pledging for the money for development of diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines. That was a recommendation out of the Global Pandemic Monitoring Board set up by WHO and World Bank. It needed about 8 billion and it more or less got it, but 8 billion is obviously the petty cash when you're talking about Kristalina Georgieva using the figure of $2.5 trillion. So what is missing is really the figures who can step forward, I think, out of the major economies, the way Gordon Brown did in 2009, backed by other G20 leaders at the time, to get that grouping, which does represent 85% of the world economy, to lead in mobilizing the resources required. And it's going to have to be quite a broad-based effort to enable the IMF to have more special drawing rights at the disposal of countries for the debt waivers and holidays and relief for increasing fiscal space. And you're right, it's not just the poorest countries who are on the line here. You have economies in the Caribbean and also the Pacific who have reached upper middle income status, and even in the case of at least one I can think of in the Pacific, at the point of graduation from developing country status. But it's all built on the deck of card tourism, which just stopped. And so, you have the need for major packages in economies which would have been considered nowhere near the bottom of the ladder. So I think we need to look to who could step forward and do this. And I think if you look across the G20 grouping, look immediately to Germany and Angela Merkel, who is globally respected, who's led, a successful response in challenging circumstances in Germany, who has the gravitas, I think, to be a mobilizer of G20, probably in liaison with President Macron, who also carries weight. But we're in a sort of particular moment where G20 currently is led by Saudi Arabia, which isn't going to step up on this. G7 is led by President Trump, or it's missing in action. So we need other leaders just prepared to say, look, we're going to get in here and push and try to rally the troops to stop the worst happening. Because as I say, if the worst happens, then you will have a series of collapses of the Venezuela kind, which will not only be quite disastrous for the citizens of the countries concerned, but have spillover impact all around their borders.
Thank you, Helen. Missing in action is not a bad way to characterize the role that the US is not playing this time around, and of course, a role that the US under President Obama did play 10, 11 years ago. Matteo, let me turn to you. Both you and Kevin said that the crisis should afford opportunities for the center left. And I want to agree with you, but I cannot help but remember that 10, 11 years ago, the crisis which brought low economic growth, unemployment, inequality was also seen as an opportunity for the center left. And out of that crisis, we got populism, and particularly right-wing populism. In the US and Brazil and Turkey and the Philippines, in India and Poland and Hungary, the list is very, very long. What must the center left, and this is a directly political question, what must the center left do differently to make sure that in fact voters do see a feasible and attractive alternative in that political segment coming out of this crisis, unlike what happened 10 years ago?
It's a good question, Andrés, because first of all, there is not one center left now around the world. Mm-hmm. There is not a philosophy of third way as 20 years ago. There are two center left. Mm-hmm. There are two left, more correctly. There is the left of Joe Biden, and there is the left of Bernie Sanders, just to Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. Right. But the same was clearly in UK, because if against Prime Minister Johnson and before Prime Minister Theresa May, Labour Party presented a man or woman came from third way, New Labour, friend of Tony Blair strategies, maybe the result should be absolutely different respect to the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. And that, I think, it's true in a lot of countries, because in every country there is a tension, a division between two lefts. Maybe the only one country in which this division it's not so important now, it's paradoxically only Germany. But the left in Germany is totally out from 20 years, in the last 20 years, totally out of the government, because also in the case of grand coalition, big coalition with a government between CDU of Angela Merkel and SPD with Martin Schulz, with Sigmar Gabriel, etc. This division between radical left and normal left are caused a real change of importance of traditional power of SPD. What is the point? There is a division before coronavirus and I think after coronavirus between two different ideas of the world. And this idea, it's very complicated for the radical left, but this position usually permit, and this is paradoxically, permit the victory of populists of right. And I give an answer to your question about the populism and the sovereignism around the world, and from Europe to America to other parts of the world. My view is that, please consider Italy, just to make an example, not only because Italy was one of the first countries hit by coronavirus. Consider Italy, because Italy is clearly a country totally connected to the globalization. Italy needs tourists around the world, from abroad. Italy needs a very important part of export, because the Italian products, the made in Italy, is very good for the rest of the world. Italy is a country usually very open to dialogue, to presence of migrants, etc. What is the point of populism? In this case, of populism of Mr. Salvini, is please block the frontiers, close the doors, change this narrative. Be careful. That message was paradoxically a message approved by coronavirus, because coronavirus blocked everyone in our jail cold houses, blocked every type of tourism, blocked every type of globalized world. And what is the consequence? The consequence is a tragedy for Italy, an economic tragedy. That means a very simple message. The idea of closing society, a society without dialogue, but only with the walls and the frontiers, is a very bad idea for the countries as my country. And paradoxically, coronavirus show the limitations, the problem of sovereignism. But at the same time, what is the next? The next is that if the European government, and in this case is true particularly for France, will not able in the next months to give a strategy of reaction for economic crisis, I think, this is my opinion, populism will come back, populism of right will come back, particularly in France, because today, if we study Europe, you understand there is not a great success from populism. There are a lot of success in newspapers, but not in the parliaments. The real problem will be 2022 France election. And just to conclude, I think it's very important change narrative because, okay, let me be very frank. A government focused on the fear is easy. To make prime minister with a great problem and with a very easy message, please, we have to be everyone all together. We have to block our activity because we have to save our lives. This is not a great problem. It's easy, the message. The real difficulty is change and pass from fear to hope. To make the prime minister with a vision, with an ideal, with a possibility of recovery is not easy, because you need an unbelievable courage and an unbelievable risk of failure. So my view is that today, after 3 months, 4 months of lockdown, polemics, healthcare dramatic situation, a lot of deaths, after that very strong period, we need a different narrative, particularly from left, able to give hope, to give a new vision, not only to make a government focused on the fear.
Thank you, Matteo. From fear to hope, that could be a good title for the narrative we're all hoping will emerge from this crisis. Both Michelle and Matteo have alerted us they may have to leave early because they have other commitments. Michelle, do we have time for one question with you before you have to leave?
Indeed.
Thank you very much. We're going to move on to questions from the audience. And the first one for Michelle Bachelet is from Graciela Piga, who says, Madam Bachelet, you have been our pride, given your work in UN Women. And the question is, in your opinion, what should be done concretely to make COVID-19 an opportunity to address structural gender inequalities?
Well, I mean, there's a lot that needs to be done, and we have, if she wants to look at more details afterwards, we have developed a guidance that is in a web page in terms of recommendation from member states to tackle the different aspects of gender inequality. And also one issue that we have seen increase dramatically during the quarantine is the gender-based violence. And I think what we need, of course, is people, women leaders to step up, to show how you can make a very important government with good policies that has a gender perspective. You need to ensure that more women are in the decision-making positions in governments, in municipalities. I mean, not only on the national level, regional level, local level. You need to ensure that you have systems like quota system that will permit to have a better representation of what a society is. Countries like mine, where it's 52% of women, and people still in the speeches speaks about minorities, and so you need more parliamentarians, you need more people on the municipality councils, more women there, that they can bring the gender perspective, that they can bring and contribute in a very special way. I think we also need to show role models and to have role models that can show that women can be great leaders and that can contribute fantastically in different levels. Of course, at the university, at the banks, at the private sector, at the public sector, and it can be done. Because in my last government, when I arrived, we had in the state-owned companies only 5% of members of the board were women, and I said I would do 40%, and we'll finish with 42%. So it means political will. I think it's important to have, if possible, paritarian cabinets. And I thank you because we have been a paritarian panel here. So that is also important because I have been in many panels, all are men and me. So I think we need to give space to women. But and because we have fantastic women everywhere. I have met so many women. So I think that it's important also to create alliances between women. I think that women who has experience and power should mentor younger women, being it SMEs or women who want to go into politics, even though politics, I have to say, is pretty ugly today. So many women don't want to go into it because it's not a nice thing to do. But I think we need more women everywhere to give them the possibilities to develop all their skills, all the capacity. And may I Just add a little thing on the question you asked to Matteo, because I believe that we are living, and before COVID, a crisis for legitimacy of political parties, political institutions, and in some places, all kinds of institutions, judiciary system, parliamentarians, and even police forces and security forces. So I believe that the center left needs to connect more with the people and their real concerns, and not because citizens feel that politicians are in a limbo, discussing on things that they don't care about them. And I feel we need to open spaces to new leaders. All these massive streets protests were all led by young people, professionals, not necessarily the poorest, a lot of women as well. And we see that in Me Too and all other social movements. And I think we need to get in touch also with more of the issues that for people are important right now, climate change, of course, technology, and so on. So I think it's good fear to hope, but it's not enough. We need new kinds of leaderships, not necessarily new leaders, but new kinds of leadership, and parties who really connect with the people, because I feel that people are really disenfranchised from parties because they don't feel that they're really concerned. And the last thing I think in the past happened, that people could not tell the difference between center-left and right, center-right sometimes, because of the policy were really similar. So I think it's a new narrative, a new opportunity for the new economy and so on, but also I think the way politics is being done has to change, because it's not something that the citizens are accepting and now. Thank you, Andrés.
Thank you very much. I have to say that I was very happy and proud to serve in what was Chile's first gender parity cabinet back in 2006. And thank you also for that reminder that the lack of trust in political institutions is really a tremendous problem in rich and poor countries alike. Both Michelle and Matteo, as I mentioned, have to leave early. I think Matteo has disconnected already. We thank him for joining us. Thank you, Michelle Bachelet, as well. And I'm going to carry on with more questions from the audience. We have a question from Sushant Subedi, who is a social policy undergraduate student here at the LSE. And this is for anybody who'd like to tackle it. He says, or she says, as the speakers highlighted the need for universal social protection after COVID, I'm hoping that they will tell us how that will be feasible, given that governments have accumulated so much debt in the course of this crisis, and that naturally the tendency will be to drive down the deficit, drive down the debt. Will that leave fiscal space for social protection? Helen, Kevin would like to tackle that.
Well, because it's later in New
you
Zealand than
Kevin.
Australia. No, it's later in New Zealand than Australia. So Helen, you go first.
Well, I think in the earlier question to Kevin, the issue came up of, is having a high level of employment very important in getting, a universal standard of living that's acceptable. And I think it is. I think I could probably say, Kevin, for Australia as well as New Zealand, the social security system has long been built on a base of pretty close to near full employment. And then, having a comprehensive net for older citizens, people with illness or disability, the parent bringing up children full-time, and so on. So I think part of the answer to getting the universal social protection equating to a widespread adequacy of income will be to get jobs and livelihoods back again and reasonably fast. That's not inconsistent, by the way, with the kinds of investments needed for the green transformation. That can be job rich, and I think that needs to be factored in going forward. But yeah, in essence, I think there needs to be a responsibility taken by the state for seeing that people do not fall into abject poverty. The support needed may not only be the support that comes through some kind of social security payment, like a cash transfer that tops up low income or an outright benefit, but it's also a question of ensuring that healthcare is covered, that that a family doesn't face bankruptcy when there's catastrophic illness, ensuring that education is accessible and affordable, and really at the the basic first 12-year levels, it ought to be free to ensure equality of access. So there's a number of ways of cutting the cake, but I do think that the sooner we can get people back in jobs and productive livelihoods, the better.
Yeah, I happen to think that the emphasis on jobs is absolutely key. So thanks for going back to that, Helen. Francis, also a student, wants to know about how do we fund institutions like the WHO? And the question is, to function effectively, such institutions will have to unshackle themselves from a financial dependence on individual nations and governments. How do you think this can be best achieved, is asking Francis. Kevin, you want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, I'm sure Helen will have views on that because she's been a senior practitioner within the UN system. Two sets of observations. One, if I could add to what Helen just said before and to the last question, it is an essential question for us all. How do we fund and finance in the current environment or in any environment significant equality programs? Given that we are collectively debt constrained. My response to that is that look at the four critical fund areas that we need. One is employment insurance. The second is universal health insurance. The third is, let's call it catastrophic injury or disability insurance. And the fourth is retirement income. We could find others, but frankly, that's not a bad four to build your pillars on. My judgment, based on the Australian experience, is if you look at just one of those pillars, which is retirement income, in this country, 25 years ago, a social democratic government mandated under law that employers and employees had to set aside 9% of their income to fund their long-term retirement. It's called a compulsory superannuation scheme. And despite the fact that Conservatives have tried to unravel it multiple times since then, including again most recently, it has achieved enormous success over time. And the whole objective is to provide decent retirement income for working families without raiding the general budget in the future for the age pension for everybody. And the objective with that level of mandatory savings, somewhere between 9 and 12%, was to enable people to retire with about 2/3 of their at-retirement income. And not with your classic European style unfunded pension schemes, which just go off into the sky. It doesn't work. So I would simply say that in terms of political constituency support, there's a way through this. And these 3 or 4 critical areas look at hypothecation of an element of a person's, let's call it, tax contribution. For example, that's what, in effect, superannuation is in Australia, or retirement income is in Australia, so that people and voters actually see what their money is being saved for. So that when you draw down on it, or the community has to draw down on it, it's not coming out of some mythical pond, it's coming out of something that I've invested in for my future. Mm-hmm. So that, I think, is a way through. WHO, different question. I've long had a view that funding of the UN agencies, the most critical ones, given that you've got general budget funding, which come from the mandatory contributions from member states, and then you have individual discretionary contributions by member states to individual organizations and even programs within organizations, is that the system has now become fraught with danger because of the collapse in, let's call it, general budget funding, some growth in some areas of the discretionary funding. Of course, the problem with discretionary funding is it skews the operations and sometimes the attention of the organization itself without pointing fingers at anybody. Look, so therefore, what's the solution? When we deem agencies to be of critical social and humanitarian relevance, things like, frankly, the World Health Organization, things like the World Food Programme, for example, these, in my judgment, should be funded to perform their functions effectively entirely out of general budget provision from the mandatory contributions of member states. We need to set up probably a hierarchy between those who are nearest the front line of human service delivery and those which are more discretionary, if you like. Otherwise, we're going to starve these institutions. And I wrote a report on UN reform, what, about 3 or 4 years ago now, where I said the problem with our UN system generally and with WHO and institutions like in particular is that over time, member states increasingly walk around them, don't use them, and they begin to fall into disrepair because they're not seen as being effective anymore, partly because they've been defunded. That's how we have death by 1,000 cuts in the multilateral system. None of these institutions will ever be abolished overnight, but I do worry about incremental damage being done over time, and that's my suggested funding response to the most critical of them.
Thank you, Kevin. As a former finance minister, I cannot but agree with the notion that we need more social protection, but we've got to fund it. Unfunded liabilities, as you put it, float off into the sky and don't work. Couldn't agree more with that. Helen, you want to take a crack at the big issue of how we fund the WHO and similar institutions?
Well, in a sense, you get what we pay for, don't you? And the WHO has had very low core funding from the member states. Most of its funding will be for particular projects. I mean, one of the tragedies of the US walking away is that if it walks away from all its funding to WHO, it basically decimates the polio program where a lot of its funding was going. So I don't really see an alternative to member states coming together in a compact to say we want to fund the lead organization in global health properly. And perhaps COVID-19 will be the wake-up call we need for that. Ebola wasn't, because it didn't spread far enough. It was disastrous for 3 small West African countries, and it's been disastrous over the last 18 months, 2 years in Democratic Republic of Congo. But by and large, it scarcely touched the West. Now we've seen what a pandemic can do, and frankly, how woefully prepared most of the global North was. Perhaps it might take more interest, for the most part, and under a Biden presidency, in funding the lead organization properly so it can do its job and can have reach and can support building the capacity in countries with less of it to fight a pandemic. I mean, what is the alternative to the member states' funding? You can't have it funded by private industry. You can't have the pharmaceutical companies going and funding it. That's a hopeless conflict of interest. Some of the foundations are generous, but they get a lot of abuse for their generosity. And the reality is that very large foundations with particular interests can skew funding as well. So my appeal really is to the vast majority of the world's countries who do support the multilateral system to stump up according to their means and the formulas. And, we need the WHO, we need it to be better, but we're going to have to pay for it out of our taxes to our governments and for them into the WHO coffers.
Thank you, Helen. As I scroll up and down the questions that our audience has sent, there are several, I'm not going to read them out loud, which come back to the issue of multilateral or international financing for development. Our audience expresses a lot of concern that institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, the regional development banks, maybe the UN system itself are coming up short, and that what we're really facing is a potential tragedy in developing countries. if either you, Helen, or Kevin would like to add something along those lines, it would be great.
Well, we are, is the short the short answer, that if more support can't be mobilized for Kristalina Georgieva and her team to do what they need to do, if there's not more support through the multilateral and regional banks, then the many emerging and developing countries which are looking to them now, as of mid-May, 103 had applied for emergency support from the IMF. They're going to miss out, and it will be catastrophic. And you will then see countries having to go into austerity and all the cuts and services that implies. So again, my call, and Kevin and I are among dozens and dozens and dozens of former heads of state and government who put our names to letters that have gone to the G20 leaders, setting up the rationale for a whip around to make sure that the international financial institutions are funded to do the job they need to do in these kinds of emergencies. It seems to me you pay now, you pay later. If you pay up front before catastrophe happens, you'll get better results than if you have to park the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff and picked up really wrecked economies and societies, which may have descended into a spiral of lawlessness and really protracted conflict. So again, we look to the world's governments to step up and support the multilateral institutions they belong to.
I think Helen, at the very beginning of this evening.
Kevin, please.
Yeah, just Helen's initial comments tonight when we began this session, saying COVID's not over. We should come back to that, because she's absolutely right. This has been an intelligent discussion on the post-COVID public policy challenges of the world. Let's call these the pan-COVID challenges, that is, now and spreading into the future. And the nature of this crisis, it strikes me, has escaped a general consensus in analysis. Public health crisis first, general economic crisis as a consequence, as a result of lockdown. And the third stage is avoidable but possible, which is a financial crisis. Having been Prime Minister during the global financial crisis, that's when my hair turned white. It began as a financial crisis in the United States, became a general economic crisis. And that's when collectively the G20 intervened. And that's what broke the fall. So the G20 intervention now, and the letter which Helen referred to before, was coordinated by our friend and colleague Gordon Brown, was absolutely right. Because right now, the IMF, there are 100 plus applications in for emergency assistance, 72 have been granted. Since we founded the fund with the Bretton Woods agreement of 44, this is unprecedented. We've never done 72 interventions simultaneously. I mean, Kristalina Georgieva should be, given a prize for just getting sleep at night, because frankly, this is an unprecedented burden for any IMF managing director. Secondly, the fact that she's been able to raise rapidly $1 trillion, US $1 trillion, that is 4 times the amount that we gave the IMF 10 years ago. And that has basically seen the IMF through this initial tranche of difficulties. However, when you look at where debt is now landing in the international system, it lands ultimately with somebody. It doesn't vanish into space, despite what the quantitative easing theorists in their ultimate intergalactical dreams may think. It actually lands somewhere on a balance sheet, either an individual balance sheet, a corporate balance sheet, a government balance sheet, or an international institution's balance sheet. Or you have default and everything which flows from that. So we have these things in the IMF called special drawing rights, SDRs. And the SDRs, in my argument, and many people, I believe, support this proposition, now need to be used as a new source of collateral to raise the remaining $2 trillion. Because unless we do so, as corporations' balance sheets degenerate, particularly if we have second wave effects, particularly if this ends up not being a single war against COVID, but a long-term war against COVID, and we end up with economies on war footings as we deal with one incoming attack after the other. This sort of creative financing approach through sovereigns to ultimately underpin the balance sheet catastrophes, which would then fall on their private financial institutions and on their corporations, not as grants, but as the equivalent of TARP, Target Asset Recovery Program, which the United States, through Hank Paulson and others, ultimately drew the American financial system into recovery after the last crisis.
Thank you very, very much, Kevin. I am looking at the clock here. We are close to our closing. I want to turn it back to Minouche in 1 second, but I cannot resist one closing temptation, which is both Matteo and Michelle had thoughts on what the center-left should do differently this time around to make sure that populism is not the big winner from this crisis. Just, do you, Helen or Kevin, want to add any thoughts on what the lessons might be?
Well, I think one of the lessons will be not to go down an austerity route. I think the problem for the centre-left in the previous crisis of GFC was often it got left with the hospital pass. It was in power at the time. It had a more conventional response, I suppose you could say. This is not that time, and I think if we look at how the government in New Zealand, which is basically a centre-left government with an eclectic element on the side, if you look at the social democracies in Scandinavia, I think or Portugal or Spain, there's going to be models coming out of this where they can not rely on austerity, but take a longer term view towards getting on top of the debt burden they've incurred, and ideally try to grow their way out of it, not cut their way out of it to get results.
Thank you very much, Helen. Kevin.
Three just quick dot points, given we're on time. One is, I don't think we should throw out the idea of a centre-left social democratic political enterprise which embraces markets and embraces equality. We can do that. We simply need to have the political craft to put a message around that, so that we're not seen as captive of financial markets, but nor are we seen as captive of failed classical socialist solutions of the past, because economic activity has to be generated in the private sector. That's number one. Number two, something, I don't have the answer to this, but let me pose the question. Why has the centre-right / far-right constantly beaten us on the question of, let's call it, identity politics around race, nationalism, religion, the usual eclectic mix, which we would call elements of populism as well? It's partly because we progressives, centre-left types, haven't applied our political imagination to what constitutes a legitimate centre-left populist message that actually excites people, not just in terms of the better angels of their nature, which is where we usually go, but in terms of legitimate aspects of identity which don't traduce our universal principles. We should not simply concede this ground to the nut jobs on the right. There is a creative way through this which doesn't put us in the defensive posture of destroying, quote, everyone's perceived sense of local identity. Thought number two, as I said, it's a question without an answer. Now, the third one goes to the structure of the global media. Frankly, I don't know a single country in the collective West at the moment, with perhaps the exception of Canada, where the mainstream media provide coverage for, let's call it, a mainstream center-left narrative on the future. What I find in the structure of the global media is that our enterprise is seen as increasingly boutique and open to ridicule, and as a consequence is denied oxygen, and that the default position is that the norm is a center-right conservative reality and populism being tolerated. We have a problem with the structure of media, for which my compatriot Rupert Murdoch is primarily, but not exclusively, to blame, because his damage to all of us through Fox in the United States, his damage in Britain through Sun and Brexit, his damage in Australia through the entire media show which he owns, is comprehensive, but that's just the Anglosphere. You go more broadly in this particular, that we call it disease of the mainstream media, denies oxygen for an effective and politically credible centre-left progressive narrative. Three thoughts.
Thank you very, very much. Minouche, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Andrés. First, thank you to our speakers who've done a fantastic job of laying out the challenges and the future agenda. I think what struck me the most was that the policy agenda for the post-COVID world sounded an awful lot to me like the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. When I listened to Helen and Michelle in particular, they talked about universal health care, basic income, securing minimum standards of living for people, a green recovery, social safety nets, gender equality. It sounds an awful lot like the SDGs. And of course, Kevin talked about a green recovery and dealing with inequalities in our societies. So it struck me that the policy agenda sounded somewhat familiar. I think the difficult question is there a political window of opportunity that makes that policy agenda viable post-COVID? And Matteo Renzi, I think, argued quite persuasively that the COVID crisis has shaken up politics in the US and may change the outcome of the election there. And it's also changed politics in the EU toward one in which greater solidarity has become more acceptable. I think the question is whether that political window of opportunity is more widespread. Will countries adopt a more outward and generous political stance, or will they turn inward and selfish? I think one of the interesting things about this disease is that, for sure, the poor have been hit the hardest. Those who have lower incomes, have worse health outcomes, those who are in racial groups that suffer from those things, the poor have been hit the hardest, but it's also hit the rich. You know, in the UK, Prince Charles got it, you know, the Prime Minister got it. And, you know, in past crises, you know, you think about World War II, the fact that people were genuinely in it together and that everyone suffered the consequences of the war created a political space around greater social solidarity, which then enabled a whole set of reforms that were transformative. And this crisis does have that character in that it does hit everyone. I think what also struck me was that I think Kevin pointed out the need for different international coalitions for the international system to work. I spent 25 years of my career in the international system at the IMF, at DFID, at the World Bank, and know from, you know, frontline experience, the countries that benefit most from a rules-based international order are small and medium-sized countries. And yet we rely on the big countries to be the guarantors of the system. And I think what Kevin was saying is we've got to stop doing that. The small and medium-sized countries, who are the biggest stakeholders in a rules-based international order, need to step up and not rely so heavily on the big countries, particularly the United States, who until now has been the guarantor of the current system. I think conversations like the one we've had today are essential building blocks to building a different narrative, both at the national level and at the international level. I've been, you know, amazed to watch the questions in the chat. Sadly, not all of them that we could get to, but, you know, we've had questions from Argentina, India, Turkey, and of course from the UK. And one of the silver linings of this dreadful crisis has been it's enabled us to get 4 global leaders on from 3 continents to have a conversation with thousands of people from across the world about the post-COVID world. And I think it's these kinds of opportunities that are precisely what is needed to lay the groundwork for a new policy narrative for the post-COVID world. I'll stop there. I think we'll come to a close, and thanks again to all those who participated, and I encourage you to join us again at future conversations hosted by the London School.